The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Bagshot Park, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. James Wessex stood before the ornate mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. Today was different from any other day in his 17 years and 11 months of life. Tomorrow, he would turn 18, and with that milestone would come decisions that could reshape not just his future, but the very fabric of the British royal family's modern structure. James ran his fingers through his dark hair, inherited from his father Prince Edward, and caught sight of his reflection's serious expression. The weight of expectation had always been there, hovering like an invisible crown above his head, but never more pronounced than in these final hours before adulthood. His parents, the Earl and Countess of Wessex, had been preparing him for this moment his entire life, yet nothing could have prepared him for the phone call that came 3 days ago from Kensington Palace. Prince William's voice had been warm but formal when he spoke to James's father. The conversation, which James had overheard from the adjacent drawing room, centered around a private gift that William and Catherine wished to present to James on his birthday. But this wasn't going to be a simple present wrapped in expensive paper with a silk bow. This was something far more significant, something that would require careful consideration and potentially alter the young man's entire trajectory. The Wessex family had always occupied a unique position within the royal hierarchy. Prince Edward, as the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II, had chosen a path that diverged from the traditional royal roles. When he married Sophie Rhys-Jones in 1999, they had deliberately sought a more private life, away from the intense scrutiny that plagued other senior royals. Their children, Louise and James, had been raised with the understanding that they could choose their own futures, free from the obligations that bound their cousins to lives of public service. James walked to his window, overlooking the expansive gardens where he had spent countless hours as a child. The estate, which had served as his family's primary residence since his father's marriage, felt both protective and confining as his 18th birthday approached. He remembered running through these very gardens with his sister Louise, playing elaborate games of hide and seek among the carefully manicured hedgerows. Those carefree days seemed like a lifetime ago now. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside his room made James turn from the window. A gentle knock on the door was followed by his mother's familiar voice asking if she could enter. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, stepped into the room carrying a steaming cup of tea, her expression mixing maternal concern with something that looked remarkably like pride. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering him the tea. "Your father and I want to speak with you about tomorrow, about the call from William and Catherine." James accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the comforting aroma of Earl Grey. "I've been thinking about it constantly, Mother. What exactly are they proposing?" Father seemed quite serious when he got off the phone. Sophie settled into the comfortable armchair near the fireplace, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension she carried. She had navigated the complexities of royal life for over 2 decades, transforming from a successful public relations executive into one of the monarchy's most respected members. Her approach to royal duties had always been measured and thoughtful, qualities she had worked hard to instill in her children. "They want to offer you something unprecedented, James. A choice that no member of our family has ever been given at such a young age." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "William and Catherine have been working with your father and me, along with advisors from the palace, to create what they're calling a modern royal pathway. It would allow you to accept a working royal role with full support and resources, but also provide you with the freedom to step back if you choose a different life." The implications of what his mother was saying began to settle over James like a heavy blanket. Throughout history, members of the royal family had been born into their roles with little say in the matter. Duty, service, and obligation were not choices but inherited responsibilities. Yet here was an opportunity to actively choose his place within the institution that had shaped his entire existence. What would accepting this pathway mean exactly? James asked, setting his teacup on the small table beside his chair. His mother smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. It would mean training alongside William and Catherine, learning statecraft, diplomacy, and public service from some of the finest minds in the Commonwealth. You would gradually take on patronages, represent the crown at various functions, and eventually be given a significant role within the working royal family. It would also mean accepting a formal title and the responsibilities that come with it. James felt his heart rate quicken. The idea of working closely with his cousin William, whom he had always admired, was certainly appealing. William had successfully modernized many aspects of the monarchy's approach to public engagement, and his marriage to Catherine had brought a fresh perspective to royal duties. But James also understood that accepting this path would mean surrendering much of the privacy and freedom his parents had fought so hard to preserve for him and his sister. "And if I choose not to accept," he asked quietly, "then you continue as you are. You finish your education, pursue whatever career interests you, and live your life as a private citizen who happens to be a member of the royal family. You would still attend family functions and major state occasions, but you wouldn't have any official duties or obligations." The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge James wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of gardeners working on the grounds, their mundane activities serving as a stark contrast to the momentous decision being laid before him. "Why now?" James asked eventually. "Why are William and Catherine making this offer?" Sophie leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "Because they recognize that the monarchy needs to evolve if it's going to survive and thrive in the modern world. They've watched how your generation approaches duty, service, and tradition differently than previous generations. They want to harness that perspective and energy, but they also want to ensure that anyone who chooses this life does so willingly and with full understanding of what it entails." James stood and walked back to the window, his mind racing with possibilities and concerns. The weight of the decision was enormous, not just for him personally, but for what it might mean for the future of the royal family. If he accepted, he would be part of a new model for how royalty could function in the 21st century. If he declined, he would retain his freedom, but might also be missing an opportunity to contribute to something larger than himself. "Have they spoken with Louise about this as well?" he asked. "Your sister will receive her own version of this conversation when she turns 18 next year. William and Catherine want each of you to make your own individual choices based on your own interests and aptitudes." James turned back to face his mother, studying her expression carefully. "What do you and father think I should do?" He wants to ensure that whatever choice you make, you'll have all the support and resources you need to succeed. James nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for his parents' thoughtful approach to this monumental decision. Many royal children throughout history had been given no choice in their futures, thrust into roles for which they were unprepared or unsuited. The fact that William and Catherine were offering him agency in determining his own path spoke to the kind of leaders they were becoming and the kind of monarchy they hoped to build. "I should go speak with father," James said, moving toward the door. "He'll be in his study reviewing the documents from today's meetings." "But, James," Sophie called as he reached for the door handle, "remember that whatever you decide, we're proud of the young man you've become and confident in the adult you're becoming." James made his way through the familiar corridors of Bagshot Park, past portraits of previous Earls of Wessex and family photographs that chronicled his childhood. The house had always felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could be simply James rather than His Royal Highness Prince James of Wessex. Tomorrow, that sense of sanctuary might change forever, depending on the choice he made. He found his father in the wood-paneled study, surrounded by official documents and correspondence. Prince Edward looked up as his son entered, his expression immediately softening from the serious concentration required by his paperwork. "James, good. I was hoping we could talk before tomorrow's meeting." Edward gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "I imagine your mother has given you an overview of what William and Catherine are proposing." "She has, but I'd like to understand more about the practical implications. What would day-to-day life look like if I accepted this role?" Edward set aside his papers and leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "It would be demanding, certainly more demanding than the life you've known so far. You would have a schedule managed by private secretaries, regular briefings on political and social issues, and a constant awareness that your actions reflect not just on yourself, but on the entire institution of the monarchy." James absorbed this information, trying to imagine his current life transformed by such responsibilities. Would I still be able to pursue my own interests? My studies. That's one of the innovative aspects of what William and Catherine are proposing. They want to create a model where working royals can maintain personal interests and even limited private careers, as long as they fulfill their official duties. It would require careful balance, but it's not impossible. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Edward explaining the various aspects of royal duty and the support systems that would be put in place if James chose to accept the offer. As they talked, James began to appreciate the complexity of what was being proposed and the careful thought that had gone into creating this new pathway. "Father," James said as their conversation began to wind down, "how did you know that royal life was right for you? Did you ever consider a completely different path?" Edward smiled at the question. "I did consider other options, particularly when I was your age. But I ultimately realized that I had been given unique opportunities to serve and make a difference, and that those opportunities came with responsibilities I couldn't ignore. The key was finding a way to serve that felt authentic to who I am as a person." As the evening approached, and the household began preparing for dinner, James found himself walking through the gardens where he had played as a child. The familiar paths and hidden alcoves that had once seemed like the entire world now felt like stepping stones leading toward an uncertain, but potentially extraordinary future. Tomorrow would bring William and Catherine to Bagshot Park, along with the formal presentation of their proposal. In less than 24 hours, James would have to begin making the most important decision of his young life. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as James made his way back toward the house. Tomorrow would mark not just his 18th birthday, but potentially the beginning of a new chapter in the long story of the British royal family. Whatever choice he made would ripple forward through generations, influencing how future members of the royal family understood their own options and obligations. As he reached the front door of Bagshot Park, James paused to look back at the gardens one more time. Childhood was ending, and, with it, the luxury of postponing difficult decisions. Tomorrow, he would step into adulthood with all its complexities and choices. The private gift that William and Catherine wished to present would require careful consideration, wise counsel, and, ultimately, the courage to choose a path that aligned with his own values and aspirations. The warm light spilling from the windows of his family home seemed to beckon him inside, where dinner would be served and the evening would unfold with the comfortable rhythms that had defined his life for nearly 18 years. But even as he crossed the threshold into the familiar warmth of home, James knew that everything was about to change. The only question remaining was how much he was willing to let it change, and what kind of man he wanted to become in the process. The morning of James's 18th birthday dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the leaded glass windows of Bagshot Park's breakfast room. James sat at the polished mahogany table, picking at his eggs Benedict while his mind raced with anticipation about the day ahead. The familiar ritual of birthday morning felt different this year, weighted with significance that extended far beyond the typical celebration. Sophie entered the breakfast room carrying a small wrapped package, her smile bright but tinged with the maternal concern that had been evident for days. "Happy birthday, darling," she said, kissing the top of his head before placing the gift beside his plate. "This is from your father and me, something to mark this particular birthday." James unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a vintage pocket watch that had belonged to his great-grandfather, King George VI. The inscription on the back read, "Time is precious, use it wisely. Love, Papa and Mama." The weight of the watch in his palm felt substantial, both physically and symbolically, representing the passage of time and the importance of the moments ahead. "It's beautiful," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Edward appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his morning suit for the day's formal meeting. "The palace has confirmed that William and Catherine will arrive at 11 o'clock. That gives us time for a quiet family breakfast before things become more official." The next hour passed with unusual quietness as the family shared their meal. Louise, who had returned from university the previous evening, regaled them with stories from her studies while carefully avoiding the weighty topic that dominated everyone's thoughts. The normalcy of sibling conversation provided a welcome respite from the anticipation that had been building for days. At precisely 11 o'clock, the distinctive sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. James watched from the drawing room window as their car pulled up the circular drive, flanked by the discreet security vehicles that always accompanied senior royals on official visits. William emerged first, his bearing confident but relaxed, followed by Catherine, who moved with the grace that had made her one of the most photographed women in the world. Prince Edward and Sophie greeted their guests at the front door with the warmth that characterized family relationships within the House of Windsor, despite the formal nature of the occasion. James straightened his tie one final time and walked to the entrance hall to join the gathering. The moment felt surreal, as if he was watching himself participate in a scene from someone else's life. "Happy birthday, James," William said, embracing his younger cousin warmly. 18 years old. I remember when you were born. It seems like yesterday. Catherine's greeting was equally warm, her genuine smile putting James at ease despite the formal circumstances. We've brought something rather special for your birthday, she said. But perhaps we should sit down for a proper conversation first. The group made their way to the blue drawing room, where chairs had been arranged in a comfortable semicircle near the fireplace. A tea service waited on the side table, along with a leather portfolio that James assumed contained the documents related to William and Catherine's proposal. The room had hosted countless important family discussions over the years, but none quite like this one. William began by acknowledging the unique nature of the conversation they were about to have. What we're discussing today represents a significant departure from how these matters have traditionally been handled in our family. Historically, royal roles were assigned rather than chosen. We believe that approach needs to change if the monarchy is going to remain relevant and effective in the modern world. Catherine nodded in agreement. We've spent considerable time thinking about how to create meaningful opportunities for younger members of the family while respecting their autonomy and individual interests. The proposal we're making to you today is the result of extensive consultation with constitutional experts, palace advisors, and family members. James listened intently as William outlined the structure of what they were calling the Royal Service Initiative. The program would allow young royals to gradually assume increasing responsibilities within the monarchy while maintaining the freedom to step back if they chose a different path. It represented a hybrid approach that honored tradition while embracing modern concepts of personal choice and professional flexibility. The practical aspects would unfold over several years, William explained, opening the leather portfolio and removing a bound document. You would begin with a gap year program that combines travel, education, and exposure to various aspects of royal duty. This would be followed by university studies with a curriculum tailored to include constitutional law, international relations, and public administration alongside whatever academic interests you choose to pursue. The scope of the proposal was more comprehensive than James had expected. Rather than simply offering him a traditional royal role, William and Catherine had designed a pathway that would allow him to explore his interests while gradually building the knowledge and experience necessary for effective royal service. The approach reflected their own evolution as working royals and their understanding of the challenges facing the monarchy in the 21st century. What about the title aspect? James asked, referring to one of the most significant elements of the proposal. Mother mentioned that accepting this pathway would involve formal recognition of my role. Catherine leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but encouraging. This is perhaps the most innovative aspect of what we're proposing. Rather than assigning you a traditional territorial title, we would work with Parliament to create a new type of designation that reflects your specific role and responsibilities within the modern monarchy. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Throughout British history, royal titles had been based on geographic territories, often dating back centuries, and carrying complex historical associations. The idea of creating a new type of title specifically designed for contemporary royal service represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy understood its own structure and purpose. William continued the explanation, his enthusiasm for the project evident in his tone. We envision something like Prince James, Duke of Service, or Prince James, Duke of Commonwealth Relations. The specific title would reflect your particular interests and the areas where you choose to focus your efforts. James felt his pulse quicken as he considered the magnitude of what was being offered. This wasn't simply an invitation to join the existing royal structure. It was an opportunity to help create a new model for how the monarchy could function in the modern era. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting. How much time would I have to make this decision? James asked, aware that the weight of the choice required careful consideration. Take as long as you need, Catherine replied immediately. This isn't a decision that should be rushed. We would suggest taking at least several months to thoroughly consider all aspects of the proposal. You might also want to spend some time observing our current activities, speaking with other working royals, and perhaps consulting with advisors who can help you understand the full implications of either choice. Sophie, who had been listening quietly throughout the presentation, asked about the support systems that would be available if James chose to accept the role. The question prompted a detailed discussion about the resources that would be provided, including private secretaries, security arrangements, and financial support for his official activities. One thing we want to emphasize, Williams said, is that choosing this path doesn't mean sacrificing your personal identity or interests. Some of the most effective royal service happens when individuals bring their authentic selves to their official roles. We would work to ensure that your particular talents and passions are central to how your role develops. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from constitutional implications to daily logistics. James found himself increasingly impressed by the depth of thought that had gone into the proposal and the genuine care that William and Catherine had shown for his well-being and autonomy. This was clearly not a casual offer, but a carefully considered invitation to participate in reshaping the monarchy for future generations. As the formal discussion began to wind down, Catherine reached for a second package that had been waiting on the side table. "Now for the actual birthday gift," she said with a smile that suggested the serious business of the morning was giving way to genuine celebration. The package contained a beautifully crafted leather journal with James's name embossed on the cover in gold lettering. Inside the front cover, William and Catherine had written a personal message for recording your thoughts, dreams, and decisions as you navigate this important time in your life. Whatever path you choose, we're proud of the young man you've become and excited to see who you'll become. The journal is meant to be practical as well as symbolic, William explained. We thought it might be helpful to have a place to record your thoughts and questions as you consider this opportunity. Decision-making of this magnitude benefits from careful reflection and documentation. James turned the journal over in his hands, appreciating both its craftsmanship and its intended purpose. The idea of documenting his decision-making process appealed to his methodical nature and would provide a valuable record of this pivotal time in his life. The remainder of the visit took on a more relaxed tone as the family shared lunch and conversation that ranged from current events to family gossip. James observed William and Catherine carefully, noting how they balanced their official personas with genuine warmth and relatability. If he chose to accept their proposal, these would be his primary mentors and colleagues in royal service. As the afternoon progressed, Louise joined the group for tea, her presence adding a different dynamic to the gathering. James watched his sister interact with William and Catherine, wondering what her own conversation would look like when she faced similar choices in the coming year. The siblings had always been close, and he found himself hoping that whatever decisions they each made would allow them to maintain that bond. "Before we leave," William said as the visit drew to a close, "we want to extend an invitation for you to spend some time with us at Kensington Palace over the next few weeks. Nothing formal or official, just an opportunity to observe what daily life looks like for working royals. It might help inform your decision." The invitation was both generous and practical, offering James the chance to see firsthand what he would be accepting if he chose the royal service pathway. The opportunity to shadow William and Catherine would provide insights that no amount of discussion could convey. "I would very much like that," James replied. "When would be convenient for you? Shall we say next week?" Catherine suggested. "We have a fairly typical schedule of engagements, meetings, and official functions. It would give you a representative sample of what this life involves." As William and Catherine prepared to depart, the atmosphere in the blue drawing room felt charged with possibility and anticipation. The formal presentation of their proposal had been completed, but James understood that the real work was just beginning. The decision he faced would require careful thought, honest self-assessment, and consideration of how his choice would impact not just his own future, but the future of the institution he would either serve or step away from. "Thank you," James said as the family gathered at the front door to bid farewell to their guests. "Thank you for the gift, for the proposal, and for giving me the choice. I promise to consider everything very carefully." William clasped his shoulder warmly. "That's all we can ask. Whatever you decide, we want it to be the right choice for you personally. The monarchy is stronger when it's comprised of people who genuinely want to be there." As the official cars disappeared down the drive, James stood with his family on the front steps of Bagshot Park, the leather journal still in his hands, and his mind buzzing with the magnitude of what the day had brought. His 18th birthday had indeed marked the beginning of adulthood, but in ways he could never have anticipated. The private gift from William and Catherine had opened a door to possibilities that would have seemed unimaginable just days before. "Well," Sophie said as they turned to go back inside, "that was quite a birthday conversation." James nodded, already mentally preparing for the weeks of reflection and observation that lay ahead. The proposal was extraordinary, but the decision was entirely his to make. As he looked back at the gardens where he had played as a child, he realized that the next phase of his life would be defined not by the circumstances of his birth, but by the choices he made as an adult. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but also strangely liberating. 2 weeks later, James found himself walking through the historic corridors of Kensington Palace at 7:30 in the morning, trying to match the brisk pace of Catherine's private secretary, Emma Hartford. The palace was already bustling with activity despite the early hour, as staff members prepared for another day of royal engagements that would stretch well into the evening. The Duke and Duchess typically begin their day with a briefing at 8 o'clock, Emma explained as they navigated through a series of increasingly formal rooms. Today's schedule includes a visit to a new children's hospital in South London, followed by a meeting with Commonwealth education ministers, and concluding with a reception for environmental charities at Clarence House. James had been staying at Kensington Palace for 5 days, and each morning had brought new insights into the complexity and scope of modern royal life. The romanticized version of royalty that existed in the public imagination bore little resemblance to the reality of detailed briefings, careful protocol, and the constant balancing of competing priorities and obligations. They entered a comfortable sitting room where William and Catherine were already reviewing folders prepared by their research team. Both were dressed formally for the day's engagements, but their demeanor remained relaxed and welcoming as James joined them for the morning briefing. "Good morning, James," William said, looking up from a document about healthcare infrastructure. "Ready for another day of royal revelations?" The past week had indeed been revelatory. James had observed dozens of meetings, witnessed the preparation that went into every public appearance, and begun to understand the intricate web of relationships that connected the monarchy to Parliament, the Commonwealth, charitable organizations, and countless other institutions. The scope of responsibility was far greater than he had imagined, but so was the potential for meaningful impact. "This morning's hospital visit should be particularly interesting," Catherine said, accepting a cup of coffee from a staff member who appeared silently at her elbow. "It's the culmination of a 3-year project that began when we identified gaps in pediatric care accessibility. Today we're opening a facility that will serve thousands of children annually." James had learned that this was typical of how William and Catherine approached their roles. Rather than simply appearing at events for ceremonial purposes, they identified issues they cared about and worked systematically over months or years to create meaningful change. The approach required deep knowledge, sustained commitment, and the ability to work effectively with experts from various fields. The briefing continued with updates on international developments that might affect the day's meeting with Commonwealth ministers. James was struck by the breadth of knowledge required to engage meaningfully on topics ranging from education policy in rural Kenya to technology infrastructure in island nations. The job demanded intellectual curiosity and the ability to quickly master complex subjects. "James, would you like to share your observations from yesterday's meetings?" William asked as they prepared to depart for their first engagement. The previous day had included a long session with constitutional scholars discussing the legal implications of the proposed Royal Service Initiative. James had found the conversation both fascinating and somewhat daunting as he began to understand the precedent-setting nature of what was being offered to him. "I was struck by how much consideration has gone into every aspect of the proposal," James replied thoughtfully. The constitutional experts seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of modernizing royal roles while maintaining constitutional stability. "But I also understand that I would essentially be participating in an experiment with no guarantee of how it would ultimately develop." Catherine nodded appreciatively. "That's a very mature observation. There are no certainties in this type of institutional evolution. What matters is having clear principles and the flexibility to adapt as circumstances change." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their security detail, signaling that it was time to depart for the hospital visit. James had become accustomed to the discreet but ever-present security arrangements that surrounded William and Catherine, another aspect of royal life that required constant awareness and adjustment. The journey to South London provided an opportunity for James to observe how William and Catherine used travel time productively, reviewing final details about the people they would meet and the specific aspects of the hospital they would be highlighting. Every moment seemed planned and purposeful, yet they managed to maintain genuine enthusiasm for each engagement. The hospital visit itself was a masterclass in public engagement. James watched as William and Catherine moved through the facility with obvious expertise, asking informed questions, listening carefully to responses, and creating moments of genuine connection with patients, families, and staff members. Their preparation was evident in every interaction, but so was their authentic interest in the work being done. "You see how they balanced the formal requirements with real human connection," murmured David Chun, William's private secretary, as they observed the Duke and Duchess meeting with young patients in the oncology ward. "That's one of the most challenging aspects of this role. You have to be simultaneously representative of an ancient institution and completely present for the individuals you're meeting." James nodded, appreciating the insight. Throughout the week, he had been impressed by the quality of the staff surrounding William and Catherine. These were clearly accomplished professionals who brought their own expertise and dedication to supporting the royal couple's work. The idea of being part of such a team was appealing, but also intimidating. The afternoon meeting with Commonwealth education ministers took place in the more formal setting of Lancaster House, where James observed a different aspect of royal responsibility. William and Catherine's role in these discussions was primarily to facilitate conversation and lend the weight of royal interest to important policy initiatives. The soft diplomacy involved was subtle but clearly effective in encouraging cooperation among nations with varying resources and priorities. "Education is one of those areas where royal engagement can make a real difference," Catherine explained during a brief break between sessions. "We can't dictate policy, but we can spotlight successful innovations and encourage the sharing of resources and expertise." James found himself taking detailed notes in the journal William and Catherine had given him for his birthday. The experience was providing concrete examples of how royal service could contribute to addressing real-world challenges, rather than simply maintaining ceremonial traditions. The modern approach to monarchy that he was observing aligned with his own values and interests in meaningful ways. The day concluded with the environmental charity reception at Clarence House, where James was introduced to dozens of activists, researchers, and organizational leaders working on climate and conservation issues. The conversations were substantive and forward-looking, focusing on practical solutions rather than symbolic gestures. "Environmental issues are particularly well-suited to royal engagement," Prince Charles explained to James during a quiet moment at the reception. "The long-term perspective that comes with our constitutional role allows us to support initiatives that might not align with short-term political cycles." James had always admired his great-uncle's commitment to environmental causes, even when those positions had been controversial or ahead of mainstream thinking. The conversation reinforced his understanding that royal service could provide a platform for championing important causes that might otherwise struggle for attention. As the week progressed, James also spent time with other working royals who offered their own perspectives on the rewards and challenges of their roles. Princess Anne's conversation was particularly memorable for its directness and practical wisdom about managing public expectations while maintaining personal integrity. "The key," she told James over lunch at Buckingham Palace, "is being clear about what you can and cannot control. You can control your preparation, your commitment, and your behavior. You cannot control how others interpret your actions or what the media chooses to emphasize. Focus on the first part and don't lose sleep over the second." These conversations with experienced royals provided James with insights that couldn't be gained from books or briefings. Each person had found their own way of fulfilling royal obligations while maintaining their individual identity and interests. The diversity of approaches suggested that there might indeed be room for the kind of innovative role that William and Catherine were proposing. On his final evening at Kensington Palace, James joined William and Catherine for a private dinner where they could discuss his observations and questions in a more relaxed setting. The conversation ranged from practical concerns about media attention to philosophical questions about duty and service in a democratic society. "What has surprised you most about this week?" Catherine asked as they shared dessert in the comfortable family dining room. James considered the question carefully before responding. "I think I was surprised by how intellectually engaging the work is. I had expected more ceremony and less substance. But what I've observed requires genuine expertise, careful thinking, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to complex discussions." William smiled at the response. "That's exactly the kind of engagement we hope to encourage more of. The ceremonial aspects of royal duty are important for constitutional and cultural reasons, but the real value comes from using the platform to address issues that matter." The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on topics ranging from the evolution of the Commonwealth to the role of social media in modern royal communication. James found himself increasingly confident in his ability to contribute to these discussions while also identifying areas where he would need additional education and experience. "I want you to know," Catherine said as the evening drew to a close, "that regardless of what decision you make, this week has confirmed our belief that your generation brings valuable perspectives to these challenges. The monarchy needs that kind of fresh thinking if it's going to remain relevant and effective." As James prepared to return to Bagshot Park the next morning, he felt a sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the complexity of everything he had experienced. The week had provided concrete examples of how the theoretical proposal might work in practice, and he was beginning to envision how his own interests and abilities might contribute to the kind of modern monarchy that William and Catherine were building. The journey back to his family home provided time for reflection on everything he had learned and observed. The leather journal was now filled with notes, questions, and observations that would inform his decision-making process. More importantly, he had gained a realistic understanding of what accepting the Royal Service Initiative would mean for his daily life, his personal relationships, and his future opportunities. That evening, James sat with his parents in the familiar comfort of the Bagshot Park Library, sharing highlights from his week at Kensington Palace. Sophie and Edward listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and offering their own observations about what they were hearing. "It sounds like you've gained valuable insight into what this choice would really mean," Edward said as their conversation began to wind down. "What are you thinking at this point?" James looked out the library window at the gardens where he had played as a child, then back at his parents, who had supported him throughout this process with wisdom and patience. "I'm beginning to think that this might be the right path for me," he said quietly. "But I want to take a few more weeks to make sure I'm choosing for the right reasons." Sophie reached over to squeeze his hand. "That sounds like a very mature approach. There's no rush to decide, and taking the time to be certain will serve you well regardless of what you ultimately choose." As James made his way to his bedroom that night, he carried with him a sense of excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. The week at Kensington Palace had transformed an abstract proposal into a concrete vision of how he might contribute to the institution that had shaped his family for generations. The decision was becoming clearer, but the implications continued to unfold with each passing day. 3 months had passed since James's transformative week at Kensington Palace, and the autumn leaves were beginning to fall around Bagshot Park as he sat in his father's study, surrounded by books on constitutional law, biographies of previous monarchs, and detailed policy papers on Commonwealth relations. The leather journal that William and Catherine had given him was now nearly full, documenting his evolving thoughts about the momentous decision that continued to weigh on his mind. The intervening weeks had been filled with careful research and thoughtful conversations with advisors, historians, and current working royals. James had also taken advantage of opportunities to observe other members of the family in action, attending events with his Aunt Princess Anne and spending time with his cousins Beatrice and Eugenie to understand how they had navigated their own choices about royal roles and private careers. "I've been thinking about something Professor Williams mentioned yesterday," James said to his father, who was reviewing correspondence at his desk nearby. Professor Williams was a constitutional historian from Oxford who had been advising James on the historical precedents for the type of role William and Catherine were proposing. Edward looked up from his papers, giving his son his full attention. "What specifically?" He talked about how the most successful adaptations in royal history have come from individuals who understood their historical moment and were willing to innovate while respecting tradition. "I keep wondering if this is one of those moments, and whether I'm the right person to help navigate it." The question had been central to James's deliberations for weeks. It wasn't enough to simply want the role, or even to feel capable of fulfilling it. He had to believe that accepting the position would serve the broader interests of the monarchy and the nation, rather than simply providing him with an interesting career opportunity. Edward closed the folder he had been reviewing and turned to face his son directly. "That's exactly the right question to be asking. Throughout our family's history, the most effective royals have been those who saw their roles as service rather than privilege. From what I've observed over these past months, you're approaching this decision with that perspective." James appreciated his father's confidence, but continued to grapple with doubts about his readiness for such a significant responsibility. At 18, he felt young to be making decisions that could affect the monarchy for decades to come. Yet he also recognized that the opportunity being offered to him was unprecedented and might not be available indefinitely. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Sophie's approach to the study. She entered carrying a tea tray and wearing the slightly bemused expression that had become familiar during James's months of intensive research and reflection. "I thought you might need some sustenance," she said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "You've been at this for hours today." James accepted the tea gratefully and realized he had indeed lost track of time while reviewing materials about the constitutional role of younger royals in other Commonwealth nations. The research had become increasingly fascinating as he discovered innovative approaches being taken in countries like Canada and Australia to modernize their relationships with the monarchy while maintaining constitutional stability. "I had a call from Catherine this morning," Sophie mentioned as she settled into a chair with her own cup of tea. "She wanted to check on how you're progressing with your decision-making and to let you know that they're planning a family gathering at Sandringham next weekend. She thought it might be helpful for you to spend some informal time with various family members before you reach your final conclusion." The invitation was both welcome and somewhat anxiety-producing. James knew that the extended royal family was aware of the proposal he was considering, and their opinions and reactions would inevitably influence his thinking. He was particularly interested in speaking with his cousin Peter Phillips, who had chosen a largely private life despite his position in the line of succession, and with Zara Tyndall, who had successfully balanced royal obligations with a professional sports career. "Did Catherine mention who would be there?" James asked. "Most of the senior family members, along with some of your cousins. It's being positioned as a casual weekend, but I suspect there will be opportunities for the kinds of conversations that might help inform your decision." Edward nodded approvingly. It would be valuable to hear different perspectives on royal service from people who have made various choices about how to balance public duty with private life. Each person has found their own approach to these challenges. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James's sister Louise, who had returned from university for the weekend. She entered the study with the casual confidence that characterized her approach to family dynamics, immediately sensing the serious nature of the discussion taking place. "Still wrestling with the big decision?" she asked, settling onto the arm of Edward's chair with the familiarity of long-established family routines. "I've been thinking about it quite a bit myself, actually." This was the first time Louise had directly addressed the decision James was facing, and he found himself curious about her perspective. As someone who would face her own version of this choice in the coming year, her thoughts carried particular weight. "What kinds of things have you been thinking about?" James asked. Louise was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I've been watching how this process has changed you over these past few months. You've become more serious, more thoughtful about big-picture issues. But you also seem energized by the complexity of what you're considering. That tells me something important about whether this path aligns with who you naturally are." The observation was perceptive and encouraging. James had indeed felt increasingly engaged with questions of constitutional governance, public service, and the role of traditional institutions in addressing contemporary challenges. The research he had been conducting felt less like work and more like exploration of subjects that genuinely fascinated him. "Have you given any thought to what your own choice might be when the time comes?" James asked his sister. Louise smiled in a way that suggested she had anticipated the question. "I'm leaning toward a different path than what you're considering. I think I'm more suited to contributing through charitable work and private initiatives rather than formal royal duties. But that's exactly why this new model is so important. It creates space for different types of service and different approaches to supporting the monarchy's mission." The insight highlighted one of the most appealing aspects of William and Catherine's proposal. Rather than creating a single template for royal service, the Royal Service Initiative was designed to accommodate individual strengths and interests while maintaining high standards for public engagement and institutional support. That evening, James took a long walk through the grounds of Bagshot Park, using the familiar paths to process the day's conversations and research. The decision was becoming clearer in his mind, but he wanted to be certain that his emerging conclusion was based on careful reasoning rather than enthusiasm for an exciting opportunity. The walk led him to the small chapel on the estate grounds, where he had often come as a child when he needed quiet space for thinking. The simple stone building had been a place of refuge during difficult times and celebration during happy moments throughout his life. As he sat in one of the wooden pews, James found himself reflecting on the deeper questions of purpose and service that underlay his decision. What did it mean to serve others through public duty? How could traditional institutions like the monarchy remain relevant while addressing the challenges of a rapidly changing world? What unique contributions could he make that would justify accepting such a privileged position? These were the questions that would ultimately determine his choice, regardless of the external benefits or challenges associated with royal life. The following week passed quickly as James completed his research and prepared for the family gathering at Sandringham. He had scheduled final conversations with several advisors, including a particularly helpful session with Lord Chamberlain's office about the practical implications of accepting a newly created royal title and the precedents such a decision would set for future generations. The drive to Sandringham on Friday afternoon felt significant, as if he was traveling toward a milestone that would clarify his thinking in important ways. The Norfolk estate had always been a place where the royal family could relax and engage with each other as individuals rather than public figures. James hoped that the informal atmosphere would facilitate the kinds of honest conversations that might resolve his remaining uncertainties. Princess Anne was the first family member he encountered after arriving at the estate, and her direct approach to addressing his situation was both refreshing and helpful. Over tea in the morning room, she shared her own perspectives on finding authentic ways to fulfill royal obligations while maintaining personal integrity and individual interests. The key thing to remember, she told him, is that royal service is ultimately about using whatever advantages your position provides to make a meaningful difference in areas you care about. The specific structure of your role matters less than your commitment to excellence and service. Her words resonated with James's own emerging understanding of what royal duty could mean in the contemporary world. Rather than simply maintaining traditions or fulfilling ceremonial functions, modern royal service seemed to require identifying important challenges and working systematically to address them through the unique platforms and resources available to members of the royal family. The weekend included a variety of informal gatherings where James was able to observe family dynamics and engage in serious conversations about the future of the monarchy. His cousin Peter Phillips shared insights about maintaining privacy and normal relationships while managing public interest, while Zara Tyndall discussed balancing professional commitments with family obligations and occasional royal duties. The thing about this family, Zara observed during a quiet conversation after dinner on Saturday evening, is that everyone ultimately has to find their own way of contributing. There's no single model that works for everyone, which is why what William and Catherine are proposing for you is so important. It creates space for innovation while maintaining the standards that keep the institution strong. Sunday morning brought the conversation James had been both anticipating and dreading throughout the weekend. William and Catherine invited him for a private walk through the estate grounds, where they could discuss his thinking without the presence of other family members or the formality of official settings. "We don't want to pressure you for a decision," William began as they walked along a path through the woods that surrounded the main house. "But we are curious about where your thinking has led you over these past few months." James had been preparing for this moment, but still found himself somewhat nervous about articulating his evolving conclusions. "I've come to believe that this opportunity represents something important for the future of the monarchy, and that I may be in a unique position to help develop this new model of royal service. But I also understand that accepting would be making a commitment not just for myself, but for future generations who might follow similar paths." Catherine nodded encouragingly. "That's exactly the kind of long-term thinking this decision requires. What we're proposing would indeed set precedents and create new possibilities for how royal roles evolve in the coming decades." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as they walked through different areas of the estate. James found himself articulating thoughts and conclusions that had been developing subconsciously over the months of research and reflection. By the time they returned to the main house, he had surprised himself with the clarity of his thinking and the conviction behind his emerging decision. "I think I'm ready to give you an answer," he said as they approached the front door. "But I'd like to discuss the final details with my parents before making any formal commitments." William smiled with obvious pleasure. "Of course, take whatever time you need for those conversations. We're confident that whatever you decide will be the right choice for you and for the family." The drive back to Bagshot Park that afternoon felt different from the journey to Sandringham 3 days earlier. James's mind was no longer wrestling with fundamental questions about whether to accept the proposal. Instead, he was beginning to think about implementation, planning, and the practical steps that would be required to make the Royal Service initiative successful. The December morning was crisp and clear as James stood once again before the mirror in his bedroom at Bagshot Park, but this time with a sense of resolution that had eluded him for months. Today was the day he would formally communicate his decision to William and Catherine, bringing to a close one of the most intense periods of reflection and consideration in his young life. The leather journal that had documented his journey sat on his desk, its pages filled with thoughts, questions, research notes, and gradually emerging conclusions that had ultimately led him to this moment. The previous evening had been spent in long conversation with his parents, during which James had finally articulated his decision with complete clarity and confidence. Edward and Sophie had listened carefully as their son explained his reasoning, his concerns about the responsibility he would be accepting, and his excitement about the opportunity to contribute to the evolution of the monarchy in meaningful ways. I've come to understand that this isn't really about choosing between a royal life and a private life, James had told them as they sat in the familiar comfort of the library. It's about choosing how I want to contribute to something larger than myself, and whether I'm prepared to accept the responsibilities that come with the unique platform I've been offered. Sophie had smiled with obvious pride as her son demonstrated the thoughtfulness and maturity that had characterized his approach to this momentous decision. Whatever you choose, we want you to know how impressed we've been with the careful consideration you've given to every aspect of this opportunity. Edward had nodded in agreement. You've approached this decision with exactly the kind of thoughtful analysis that will serve you well in whatever role you ultimately choose to pursue. That gives us confidence that you're making the right choice for the right reasons. Now, as James prepared for the morning's phone call to Kensington Palace, he felt a sense of calm certainty that had been building gradually over the past several weeks. The months of research, observation, and reflection had ultimately led him to a conclusion that felt both inevitable and exciting. He was ready to accept William and Catherine's proposal and to begin the challenging but rewarding process of helping to create a new model for royal service in the modern era. The call was scheduled for 9 o'clock, allowing time for William and Catherine to review their schedules and discuss next steps if James's answer was affirmative. As he made his way to his father's study, where the conversation would take place with his parents present, James felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded him of his 18th birthday morning when this entire journey had begun. Edward was already waiting in the study, having set up the conference call equipment that would allow for a clear conversation with Kensington Palace. Sophie joined them a few minutes before 9, carrying a tea service and wearing the expression of supportive concern that had characterized her demeanor throughout James's decision-making process. At precisely 9 o'clock, the phone rang, and William's voice came through clearly from London. Good morning, James. Good morning, Uncle Edward and Aunt Sophie. I hope everyone is well today. The pleasantries were brief, but warm, reflecting the family relationships that existed alongside the formal nature of the conversation they were about to have. Catherine's voice joined the call moments later, and James could sense their anticipation about what he was preparing to tell them. I know you've been taking time to thoroughly consider our proposal, William began, and we're eager to hear what conclusions you've reached. But first, we want you to know that whatever you've decided, we respect your choice and appreciate the serious thought you've given to this opportunity. James took a deep breath before responding, aware that his next words would set in motion a series of events that would reshape his life and potentially influence the future development of the monarchy itself. Thank you both for your patience and support throughout this process. After months of careful consideration, research, and reflection, I've decided that I would like to accept your proposal and participate in the Royal Service Initiative. The silence that followed his announcement lasted only a few seconds, but felt much longer to James as he waited for William and Catherine's response. When it came, their enthusiasm and pleasure were unmistakable. That's wonderful news, James, Catherine said immediately. We're absolutely delighted that you've chosen to join us in this new venture. We're confident that your perspectives and energy will contribute significantly to what we're trying to build. William's response was equally positive. This is exactly the kind of decision that gives me hope for the future of our family and the institution we serve. I'm excited to begin working with you to develop this new model and to help you build the knowledge and experience you'll need to be successful. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour as they began to discuss the practical implications of James's decision. The first step would be the formal announcement of his choice and the beginning of preparations for the gap year program that would provide him with broad exposure to various aspects of royal duty and international relations. We envision announcing your decision in the new year, William explained, which would give us time to finalize the details of your initial program and to prepare the constitutional paperwork for your new title. We're thinking of something like Prince James, Duke of Modern Service, or perhaps Prince James, Duke of Commonwealth Innovation, to reflect the forward-looking nature of your role. The idea of having a title that explicitly referenced innovation and modernization appealed to James immensely. It would serve as a constant reminder that his role was not simply about maintaining traditions, but about helping the monarchy evolve to meet contemporary challenges and opportunities. Catherine outlined the educational component that would run alongside his practical experience. We've been working with several universities to develop a curriculum that combines traditional subjects like constitutional law and diplomatic history with more contemporary areas like sustainable development, digital communication, and cross-cultural leadership. You would have access to some of the finest minds in these fields. James found himself taking detailed notes as they discussed the various elements of the program. The scope was ambitious but carefully planned, designed to provide him with both broad knowledge and deep expertise in areas that would be central to his future responsibilities. What about the ceremonial aspects? James asked, thinking about the formal duties that would inevitably be part of his royal role. I want to make sure I understand how those would balance with the more innovative work we're discussing. William's response reflected his own experience in balancing tradition with modernization. The ceremonial duties are important for constitutional and cultural reasons, and you would gradually take on more of them as your experience grows. But we see them as part of a broader portfolio of responsibilities rather than as ends in themselves. They provide opportunities to represent the crown and to connect with people, but they're most meaningful when they're connected to substantial work on issues that matter. The conversation also addressed the support systems that would be put in place to help James succeed in his new role. He would have his own private secretary, access to research staff, and mentorship from various members of the royal family who had experience in different aspects of public service. One thing we want to emphasize, Catherine said as the conversation began to wind down, is that this is a collaborative effort. We're not just offering you a position, we're inviting you to help create something new. Your ideas and perspectives will be central to how this role develops. After the call ended, James sat with his parents in a moment of quiet reflection on what had just occurred. The decision was now final, and formal plans were beginning to take shape for the next phase of his life. The uncertainty that had characterized the past few months was giving way to excitement about the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. How do you feel? Sophie asked, studying her son's expression carefully. James considered the question before responding. I feel nervous about the responsibility I'm accepting, but also energized by the possibility of contributing to something important. This feels like the right choice for who I am and who I want to become. Edward nodded with obvious satisfaction. That's exactly how you should feel about a decision of this magnitude. The combination of excitement and serious awareness of responsibility suggests that you're approaching this opportunity with the right mindset. The remainder of the day was spent in planning conversations about the practical arrangements that would need to be made before James began his new role. There were educational decisions to finalize, living arrangements to consider, and security protocols to establish. The complexity of launching this new type of royal position was considerable, but each conversation reinforced James's confidence in his decision. That evening, James called his sister Louise at university to share his news personally before any formal announcements were made. Her response was enthusiastic and supportive, reflecting the close relationship they had maintained throughout this process. I'm so proud of you, she told him. You've handled this entire situation with such maturity and thoughtfulness. I think you're going to do incredible things in this role. Louise's support meant a great deal to James, particularly as she would be facing her own version of this decision in the coming year. Their conversation reinforced his hope that the Royal Service Initiative would create space for different types of contribution to the monarchy's mission, allowing each individual to find authentic ways to serve. As December progressed toward the new year, James found himself increasingly focused on the future rather than dwelling on the decision-making process that had brought him to this point. He began reading more extensively about the specific regions and issues he would likely encounter in his new role, and started thinking about the kinds of initiatives he might want to develop once he had gained sufficient experience and expertise. The formal announcement of his decision was scheduled for early January, after which his life would become significantly more public and structured. James understood that he was about to lose much of the privacy and spontaneity that had characterized his first 18 years, but he was also gaining access to resources and opportunities that would allow him to contribute to important work on a global scale. On New Year's Eve, as the family gathered at Bagshot Park for their traditional celebration, James felt a deep sense of gratitude for the support and guidance he had received throughout his decision-making process. His parents had provided wisdom without pressure, William and Catherine had offered an extraordinary opportunity without coercion, and various advisors and family members had shared their insights without trying to unduly influence his choice. As midnight approached and the calendar prepared to turn to a new year, James stood in the garden where he had played as a child, looking up at the stars and contemplating the journey that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of preparations for a life he could barely have imagined 6 months earlier. But tonight, he felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from making a difficult decision carefully and reaching a conclusion that aligned with his deepest values and aspirations. The boy who had received an unprecedented birthday gift from William and Catherine was about to become a young man embarking on a path that could influence the future of the British monarchy for generations to come. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to contribute to something meaningful and lasting. James Wessex was ready to begin the next chapter of his life, carrying with him the lessons learned from months of careful deliberation and the excitement of knowing that his best days of service were still ahead of him. The decision had been made, the path was clear, and the future was filled with possibilities that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first unwrapped that leather journal on his 18th birthday. The private gift had indeed led to a royal title decision, but, more importantly, it had led to the discovery of a purpose that would guide James through whatever challenges and opportunities awaited him in his new role as a modern working royal.